Menachem Begin once wrote that he read this morning's Torah reading, Parshat Vayishlach, on the eve before every diplomatic mission. Imagine that. Before every diplomatic mission that Menachem Begin had as Prime Minister of Israel, he read this morning's Torah reading. A representative of the Jewish people, he thought, must be vigilant and awake and must be morally armed and decisively prepared. The question, of course, is, why this parsha? What is it in Vayishlach that Begin found prepared him for his diplomatic missions? One doesn't have to go too far in order to find potential responses to this question. The parsha begins with diplomacy. Yaakov and Esav have been apart for 20 years. They had a little bit of a fight. Esav wanted to kill his brother, so Yaakov fled. Now they're coming back, and Yaakov gets word that Esav is coming to meet him with 400 men on horseback. He thinks maybe he's coming with an armed force and perhaps he still bears a grudge. So what does Yaakov do? He sends emissaries and gifts. In other words, diplomacy. Is there perhaps something that's in our mutual interests by which you won't kill me and we can find an ability to move forward? Diplomacy. Now, in case that diplomacy fails, he also prepares his camp for battle. He divides his camp into two. There's a forward camp on one side of the river and a rear camp on the other side of the river. And his thinking here is, according to many of the commentaries, that he is practicing what is known as the weak victim strategy in war. That should Esav come and attack the first camp, they might be destroyed, but the second camp will have enough time to flee if necessary. So he prepares for war. And only then, says the Torah, does he pray. Which also, by the way, tells us something interesting about prayer. Prayer comes only after you've done everything within your power in order to address whatever the circumstance is that you have. He doesn't pray first for God's help. He practices diplomacy, he prepares for battle, and then he prays. There's also in the Parsha this whole incident of the wrestling match with this mysterious Ish. Is he wrestling with himself? Is he wrestling with Esav, his brother? Is it an angel? Right? There's all sorts of things to wrestle with. And perhaps Begin read the Parsha before every diplomatic mission to see this biblical model of Yaakov, of diplomacy, of preparation, and of prayer. And then also, because of the wrestling that Yaakov had to do, perhaps it was indicative or inspiring for Begin for the wrestling that he had to do, for the choices that he had to make as prime minister. The weak victim strategy, by the way, as my colleague and friend Rabbi Joshua Kulp, who is the Rosh Yeshiva of the Conservative Yeshiva in Jerusalem, says, is identified by no less even than Rambam, than Maimonides, who explains that Yaakov is hoping that if Esav attacks successfully, one group at least will survive. This strategy, this weak victim strategy of war, is ancient. Some Midrashim, on the other hand, like Midrash Rabbah, does not read the verse as a war strategy, but rather as a positive prediction for events that will come later on in Jewish history, according to Kulp. For example, the verse Vayomer Im Yavo Esav Ela Machaneh Achat V'hikahu Elu Achenu B'darom. He said, if Esav comes upon one camp and smite it, the remaining camp will survive. V'haya machane nishar lifleita elu achenu shebegalut, that this is as it is for those in the diaspora. Amar Rabbi Hoshaya, says Rabbi Hoshaya, Af alpi shenish aru lifleita mitanyin hayu alenu bishnei uvechamishi. Rabbi Hoshaya said, even though they survived, meaning even those in the diaspora survived what happened to Israel at the fall of Jerusalem during the Roman destruction, occupation, and expulsion, they continued to fast on our behalf on Mondays and Thursdays, meaning that there was an ongoing connection between those in the diaspora and their concern for those that were under oppression and attack within Israel or in other places. The reference point of this midrash, by the way, I was mistaken, was not the destruction of the temple, but was actually the Bar Kokhba rebellion from 132 to 135. And what happened in the Bar Kokhba rebellion was that the entire south of Israel was destroyed and demolished, and the north of Israel, those who lived in the Galilee and in the Golan, were able to survive and eventually even moved farther to Babylonia. Jerusalem falls and is razed, and Jews, after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, were prohibited from living in Jerusalem, which, by the way, is the only time in Jewish history other than after the War for Independence, when Jordan controlled the Old City, that Jews were not living in Jerusalem. We count the Omer, and during that period of the Omer from Pesach to Shavuot, we remember the destruction of Bar Kokhba. According to tradition and to Josephus, perhaps 1 million Israelites were killed at that time, and so all the morning rituals of the Omer relate to this time period. As the Midrash points out, we might be in the diaspora, but we're still remembering and relating to the oppression and destruction that others have had. And if we think about this from a larger perspective of Jewish history, in which the Talmud sees Esav as Rome and Yaakov as the Jews, what we have here is a circumstance in which the south might be lost, but the north survives. Jews in one place in the diaspora might be oppressed, even murdered, or expelled, but Jews in some place else in the diaspora will survive. And many scholars believe that it's that diaspora experience where something might happen in one location, but in the other location they managed to survive, that played an important role in the continuity and longevity of the Jewish people. And as in the Midrash, we continue to pray, to fast for Am Yisrael in the diaspora, because very often there's little that we can do. Even think about today, right? What are the prayers that we said today in the diaspora? We said prayers for the IDF, and we said prayers for the hostages. And we in the diaspora, other than our prayers and perhaps providing funding and some supplies, there's not much that we can do other than to express our solidarity with our fellow Jews throughout the world. Now, Zionism and the state of Israel was supposed to break this cycle, this notion of the passivity espoused in the Midrash of the Jewish people. No longer do we accept defeat or destruction in one area in order to survive in the other. Prayers are not enough. We have a state, we live in it, and we must defend ourselves to live in our land. We're living in a time in which Yaakov is not weaker than Esav. In fact, Yaakov, in many instances, is stronger. Just look at the events that took place around Hezbollah, Iran, Syria. Now, it is true that Hamas surprised Israel. But that's not because Israel was weak. It was perhaps Israel fell asleep at the wheel. If you look at what Israel did Hezbollah, where they were paying attention, you see that Hamas's success was not because of the strength of Hamas, but rather the weakness of that moment of Israel, a weakness that we've yet to fully come to grips with and understand. But Israel seems to have reasserted its deterrence, even though for a moment in this war, Israelis from the south, from the Gaza envelope, and also from the north, were displaced. The hostages are not yet freed or returned, but there is a ceasefire with Lebanon. There are signs of hope for a ceasefire with Hamas and Gaza. And in Syria, in order to prevent Syrian strategic weapons falling into the hands of terrorists or those that would use them against Israel, Israel has now destroyed some 85 to 90% of Syria's capabilities. Now, when I think about this Parsha and I think about the political circumstance in which we live today, I don't think Bibi's reading it before every diplomatic mission. I've met Prime Minister Netanyahu several times. In fact, I'm almost sure he's not reading the Parsha before the diplomatic meetings. But if he were to model Begin, what elements of this Parsha might he look to today for inspiration and guidance? Well, Yaakov to Yisrael, he who battles with God and humanity and wins, comes to mind. There's also a text that I taught during the week at Mincha. The beginning of the Parsha, we learned Vayira Yaakov Ma'od. Yaakov was very afraid. Vayetzer lo, and he was anxious. Vayachatz et ha'am, and he divided the people with him. Asher ito, ve'etzon ve'et bakar ve'gamalin lishnei machanot, and he divided his camp into two. The rabbis, looking at the beginning of this parsha, want to know, why is there a redundancy or something that seems superfluous? That Yaakov was very afraid and he was anxious. Wouldn't it be enough just to say one of them, not both? And so what the rabbis learn is that Yaakov was greatly afraid. He was afraid that he might be killed, and he was anxious that he might be forced to kill others. He was worried perhaps about being forced to engage in a war and have to kill others. He was worried about what we euphemistically call today collateral damage. Golda Meir, perhaps she was reading the Parsha when she said, I can forgive the Palestinians for killing our children. I can't forgive them for causing us to kill theirs. Maybe she was thinking about that verse, that pasuk. Regardless, the Parsha begins with the desire for diplomacy, for peace. And we as Jews end all of our prayers, all of our blessings with that desire as well. Peace is the loftiest of our brachot. We end the Amidah with the prayer for peace. We end Kaddish with a prayer for peace. And the final thought of the Mishnah, the final thought that the Mishnah sought to teach, was a prayer for peace. Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta said, the only vessel found by the Holy One Baruch Hu that can contain a blessing to Israel is shalom, is peace. Without peace, there is no blessing. That's true for all sides that engage in bloody conflict. Without peace, there is no blessing. Maybe that's why Begin would read the Parsha, because it would morally arm him for the challenges that Israel would face. and continued to be challenged by in its search for shalom, for peace. Shabbat shalom.